Drunk kickboxer shows off for royal guards, instantly regrets it. The streets of London buzzed with life as crowds of tourists swarmed Buckingham Palace, eager to capture the grandeur of the historic landmark. The square in front of the palace gates was packed, flashes from cameras flickered, children laughed, and the hum of conversation blended into the background. The royal guard stood in their signature red uniforms and tall black bearskin hats, as motionless as statues. Their unshakable discipline fascinated visitors, many of whom tried to provoke a reaction just to witness a crack in their legendary composure. But nothing ever worked. Until today. Jake, a 32-year-old former MMA fighter, staggered onto the square, the heavy scent of alcohol trailing behind him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and built like a man who had spent years in the ring. His face told the story of countless fights, a crooked nose from an old break, swollen ears from too many rounds, and a long scar stretching across his left cheek. His black leather jacket was scuffed, his jeans were worn, and his boots looked like they had been through one too many bar fights. But the most telling part of his appearance was his eyes, glazed, unfocused, yet brimming with reckless confidence. Jake wasn't here for sightseeing. He was here for entertainment, his own. As he swayed slightly, his gaze locked onto one of the royal guards. The soldier stood perfectly straight, his polished boots gleaming under the streetlights, his expression unreadable. Jake smirked. A man standing still, refusing to acknowledge the world around him? That was a challenge. "Let's see about that," he muttered under his breath, his grin widening. Staggering toward a trash bin, he rummaged through discarded wrappers and empty bottles until he found what he was looking for, a crumpled paper coffee cup. He turned it in his hands, laughing softly to himself. The crowd started to take notice, sensing something was about to happen. Phones were pulled out, whispers spread, and a few people exchanged uneasy glances. Jake walked up to the guard, swaying slightly but keeping just enough control to pull off his act. He froze in front of the soldier, steadying his face, searching for any sign of reaction. Nothing. The guard remained unshaken. With exaggerated precision, Jake slowly reached up and placed the cup directly on top of the soldier's tall hat. The crowd gasped. The air thickened with anticipation. The game had begun. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The royal guard remained motionless, as if he hadn't even noticed the cup sitting on top of his hat. The crowd held their breath, eyes darting between the soldier and the drunk man standing before him. Some people chuckled nervously, others whispered to each other, wondering if this would finally be the moment a guard reacted. But Jake wasn't here just to place a cup on a hat. No, he wanted more than that. He wanted a show. A wicked grin spread across his face as he turned to the crowd, arms outstretched like a magician about to unveil his grand trick. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the world's most patient man," he announced, his words slightly slurred but full of arrogance. A few people laughed, others just watched, unsure of what he was about to do next. Then, the idea struck him. Jake took a few steps back, stretching his arms and cracking his neck like a fighter preparing for a big move. He had spent years in the ring, his kicks were powerful, precise, and controlled. Or at least, they used to be. But tonight, with alcohol clouding his reflexes and judgment, he wasn't exactly in prime condition. That didn't matter to him. In his mind, he was about to pull off a move so impressive that it would be replayed on the internet 1,000 times. He planted his feet, exhaled sharply, and with the dramatic energy of a man who thought he was invincible, he swung his leg high into the air, aiming to knock the cup off the guard's hat with perfect precision. Except, he miscalculated. Instead of hitting the cup, his foot veered slightly off course. The moment played out in slow motion for the crowd. His boot soared past the cup, completely missing its target, only to collide, full force, with the royal guard's face. A collective gasp ripped through the square. People froze, stunned into silence. Some clapped their hands over their mouths, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Phones that had been recording as a joke were now capturing something far more serious. Jake's face dropped. He stumbled backward, his intoxicated mind struggling to process what had just happened. He had wanted to make the guard break character, to force some kind of reaction. He had succeeded. But not in the way he had planned. For a brief moment, time stood still. The shock of what had just happened settled over the square like a thick fog. The royal guard, always composed, always motionless, had just been kicked in the face. The crowd held their breath, eyes wide, phone still recording. Nobody knew what was about to happen next, but they all knew one thing. This was not going to end well for Jake. He staggered back, his drunken mind struggling to catch up with reality. His heart pounded against his ribs. He hadn't meant to hit the guard, not really. He had aimed for the cup, for a harmless little stunt that would get a few laughs, maybe go viral. But now, standing there with the eyes of dozens of spectators locked onto him, he realized something with gut-wrenching clarity. He had crossed the line. Then, the guard moved. It happened so fast that most people barely processed it until it was over. 1 second, the soldier stood frozen like a statue, unshaken by the chaos around him. The next, he struck. With precise, calculated force, the guard stepped forward and drove the butt of his rifle straight into Jake's chest. The impact was brutal. A deep, hollow thud rang out across the square, followed by a sharp gasp as the air was ripped from Jake's lungs. His body crumpled instantly, his knees slamming against the cold pavement. He clutched his chest, wheezing, trying desperately to suck in air that refused to come. The crowd erupted. Some people gasped in shock, others let out nervous laughter, as if unsure whether they had just witnessed something illegal or something deeply satisfying. A few clapped, murmuring things like, "Well, he had that coming." But all around, cameras stayed fixed on the scene, capturing every second. Jake's vision blurred as he rocked forward, still gasping for breath. The pain in his chest was unbearable, a searing reminder of his mistake. His body trembled, his fingers curling against the stone pavement. He wanted to say something, to protest, to argue that it had all been an accident. But no words came. Above him, the royal guard loomed like an immovable force, his face unreadable, his posture unshaken. He had moved not out of anger, not out of emotion, but out of duty. Jake had wanted a reaction. He had just gotten one. Jake was still on his knees, gasping for air, his chest on fire from the rifle's impact. His mind spun, struggling to process what had just happened. The man who had once prided himself on his strength, his ability to take a hit in the ring, now found himself completely defenseless, brought down in a single move by a soldier who hadn't even broken form. The crowd roared to life around him. Some people laughed, their voices filled with a mix of amusement and disbelief. Others gasped, murmuring in shock. A woman in the front covered her mouth, whispering, "Did that just happen?" But the most noticeable reaction came from the dozens of phones still recording. The moment had been caught from every angle, each frame capturing Jake's downfall in perfect clarity. Still struggling to catch his breath, he tried to push himself up, but his body wasn't cooperating. His limbs felt weak, shaky. His lungs burned as he sucked in short, desperate gasps. He lifted his head slightly, just in time to see movement beyond the crowd. 2 police officers were making their way toward him. Reality crashed down on him like a ton of bricks. No, He muttered under his breath, trying to scramble to his feet, but it was useless. His legs buckled beneath him, and before he could make another move, a firm hand grabbed his arm. "Stay down," one of the officers ordered. Jake tried to protest, but before he could form a coherent sentence, he felt his other arm yanked behind his back. Cold steel clicked around his wrists. Handcuffs. The weight of the situation finally settled in. "You're under arrest for assaulting a royal guard," the second officer stated, his voice calm, almost bored, as if this were just another day on the job. The crowd erupted again, but this time there was no sympathy in their voices. Some cheered, others jeered, and a few shouted sarcastic remarks. "Smart move, buddy. Bet that wasn't part of the plan." Laughter rippled through the square. Jake wanted to fight back, wanted to explain that it had been a mistake, that he hadn't meant to actually hit the guard. But deep down, he knew it didn't matter. The only fight he had left was with himself. And he had already lost. Jake sat in the back of the police car, wrists bound tightly in cold metal cuffs, his head throbbing, his chest aching from the brutal hit he had taken. The flashing lights outside reflected off the window, casting streaks of blue and red across his face. His mind was a storm of panic, humiliation, and regret. This wasn't supposed to happen. This was just a joke, a stupid, drunken stunt to impress a crowd. But now, as he felt the weight of his situation settle in, he realized there was no undoing what had been done. The officers up front were silent, their expressions unreadable. They didn't have to say anything. The message was clear: he had screwed up big time. As the car pulled away from Buckingham Square, the last thing Jake saw was the crowd still gathered, phones held high, capturing every second of his downfall. Some were still laughing, others shaking their heads. He had thought he was in control of the moment. Instead, he had become the joke. By the time he was processed at the station, the internet had already sealed his fate. His name, his face, his humiliating fall, it was everywhere. Videos spread like wildfire, news outlets picked up the story, and headlines screamed his stupidity to the world. Drunk American fighter attacks Royal Guard, instantly regrets it. Tourist tries to humiliate guard, gets knocked down instead. The footage played on repeat, dissected, memed, shared across every platform. Millions of people were laughing at him. Then came the real consequences. A $25,000 fine, money he didn't have. A permanent ban from the UK. He would never set foot in the country again. But the worst hit was his career. Sponsors pulled out, gyms cut ties, and even his own teammates turned their backs on him. He wasn't a fighter anymore. He was a walking meme, the guy who got taken down by a soldier who hadn't even lifted a fist. Meanwhile, the Royal Guard stood exactly where he had been before. Unshaken. Unmoved. Untouched by the chaos. The same discipline, the same unwavering posture. To the guard, Jake had never even existed. And now, in the eyes of the world, Jake barely did either. What do you think about Jake's downfall? Was it deserved, or was it just an unfortunate mistake? Should the Royal Guard have reacted differently, or was this the perfect example of discipline in action? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Would you have done anything differently in this situation? Let's hear what you think.